Back in my 20s, I found a cheap place to live by browsing Craigslist. Yes, I know it was probably a stupid idea, boarding with complete strangers, but back at the time, Craigslist wasn't as sketchy, and there were no weird vibes coming off from the other people that lived there, so I didn't see any problems with it. I found a place owned by an older couple. They were sweet and explained that it was actually an old duplex that they turned into a house. They said they weren't going to be getting the money back they put into it if they sold it, so they decided to rent it out, hoping to help others out as well as turn a profit. On the day of move-in, they were there to greet me, go over some more guidelines, and give me the key to my room. We all had keys to the actual house, and then our rooms locked so we could still have privacy, which I appreciated. They also introduced me to my new roommates. There were two other girls, Erin and Abigail. Abigail, or Abby as she told us to use, was actually our landlord's daughter. They were both nice girls and seemed like people I would hang out with, so it seemed like it would work out. There was a fourth room that wasn't filled yet, but they were planning on having someone move in soon. It turned out to be a good time though. We all got along fine. We seemed to share chores without even really asking or planning it out, which was awesome too. Even when you would think the daughter would be spoiled and run amok, she wasn't. She was actually quite normal and respectful. Maybe normal wasn't the right word though. For the longest time, she was fine. It was probably close to a year that things got weird. By this time, it was us three and another girl moved in named Gabriella. Abby was going on some kind of mission trip. This is based on how she explained it, for about a month in another country that I now no longer remember. She had two birds, turtle doves, and she asked me to take care of them while she was gone. She left the key to her room with me and told me some of the basic things, and I agreed to do it. When she came back from her trip though, she seemed different. Her whole demeanor changed. We would ask how her trip was, and she explained some of the things she did and learned, but then she would also just go on about some religious history lessons that no one asked for. I get it, and I have no problem with people that are religious, but when we're sitting watching a movie and she just speaks up and starts going on about how this guy tried to warn people in his village of the plague, but they didn't listen. That's why we need to pay more attention. And then would just go back to watching TV. It was really weird, and we all saw it too when we were around. When Erin and I were home by ourselves, we brought it up and agreed that she was weird, but we would let it go until it started interfering with one of us. Again, the landlords, her parents, seemed to be very nice people, but we didn't know how they would take us complaining about their daughter. So we just kept tallies on things she did in case it got worse. Over time, she seemed to become more reclusive. She wouldn't eat anything we made, saying our bodies are sacred and we needed to open our eyes to what we put in it. In fact, I don't think we ever saw her eat anymore after that. She rarely left the house, but when she did, it was very short and she always had sunglasses on and some kind of blanket or scarf covering her head. But for the most part, she confined herself to her room. We would knock on her door to invite her to watch or play a game with us or go somewhere, but she would never open the door, and the offers were always declined. Eventually, it just became a point that we would knock on the door to make sure she was alive. Her parents would stop by at the beginning of the month to collect rent, and they even asked us how she was doing. That was a surprise to me because I figured at least they would have had contact with her, but apparently not. So we told them what we had been experiencing, and they said they were seeing the same thing, except she wasn't answering their calls even. They came in and tried knocking on Abby's door, and I think she was expecting one of us and answered as she normally did. Until her mother started talking and her demeanor changed and she called them by their name. She said something like, "I no longer need your help, Bonnie. Please, let me go." They looked upset and confused, but they left, saying to contact them if anything else happens. They thought it had something to do with the trip she went on, but they weren't certain. They told us about some pamphlet she got from a customer at her work and decided to go to it on their dime. She said they would pay them back, but of course never did, and now she's acting like this. It didn't take long for it to escalate though. After a while, we could hear music coming from her room that consisted of very low drum beats and humming, all while she was singing nonsense above it. We could never make out words, but it was like someone was trying to sing a song they didn't know the words to. Then we could smell the incense. Then we could smell things worse than incense. It was seeming like the incense was trying to cover up the smell of whatever else was in there. It smelled like rotting foods, which would make sense since she never came out. If she had plates and bowls or even trash in there that was festering, it was going to start smelling, especially since we were hitting the summer months. We actually had to buy some cheap plates because she seemed to come out at night when we were gone or asleep and would take them and never bring them back. The smell, though, only got worse. You could smell it if you were at the door, but it started wafting out into the hall. Gabriella seemed to take all she could and started beating on her door, telling her she needed to do her part because she was making the place stink. But when she finally responded, she spouted something about needing to repent first, then she could proceed with her human chores. So here's where it all came crashing down. One night while I was sleeping, I could hear my name being whispered. I normally didn't lock my door when I was sleeping because I trusted the girls, but I was still surprised when I opened my eyes to actually see someone in my room standing by my door. It startled me and I went to turn on my side lamp when she stopped me, saying not to. I knew at that point it was Abby. She said she had to go somewhere important and I was the only one she trusted, and I still have no idea why. She told me not to let anyone in her room, not even me or Bonnie and Roger, her parents. I agreed and asked her when she would be back, and she said she didn't know. Then she left my room, said some weird spiritual sounding quote, and left. I went back to sleep though and figured I would handle it if it was real in the morning. Sure enough, the next morning, I got up and noticed her keys and her little car were gone. I tried calling her cell phone and it went straight to voicemail. But really, I don't know if it had been that way for a while. It looked like Aaron had left already and Gabriella was taking a shower. So I just made breakfast and everything kept circling in my head. I thought I should at least tell her parents so they knew she wasn't home, but then I remembered her birds. Surely they were going to need to be fed, and I decided I would use that as an excuse for going into her room. So I made my way to her room. The smell had weakened again, so you could only smell it at her door. I turned the knob and, surprisingly, it wasn't locked. I do, however, wish I hadn't opened it now. Horrible. The smell hit me first. I was surprised how much that door was holding back. It smelled just of decay. The windows were covered with her blankets and sheets. She had a little twin or full-size bed, and she had it leaning against the wall. The mattress seemed to be cut down the center, and things were being stored in it. I didn't get close enough to see what exactly. The floor was scribbled on with all kinds of incoherent writing and drawings. Then there was her dresser, placed against the left wall. The top of it just had heads, like her birds' heads and other small animal heads. Some just the skull, some still had skin attached to it, all with their eyes sewed shut. I think I found out what all the smell was coming from, and I ran out of the room, leaving the door open. I screamed for Gabriella, and she came into the kitchen, and I explained to her what had happened, and she immediately went back and looked. She also shouted out some things, and we agreed to call Bonnie first. We explained what we had seen, and they were over there pretty quickly. They seemed just as horrified as us. I'm not sure what all happened. They probably wanted to keep it somewhat private, but some people showed up. They all took pictures of the room, and I think it was a friend of Roger and himself went in the room and completely cleaned it out. Gabriella had already left, not wanting to deal with it, and they asked me to leave for a bit to finish, and I agreed. When I returned, Roger and Bonnie were still there, and as I walked back to my room, her door was open, and I noticed her room was almost entirely empty. They then told me that when she got home, they were going to move her back in with them until she was, quoted, better. She didn't come home that night though, and it was actually a few days before she did. Apparently, she didn't like the idea of her room being emptied, and she let out a blood-curdling scream, waking all of us up. I ran out of my room, which was across from hers, and she immediately turns around and started screaming about how she trusted me and that I would pay with my soul. Gabriella and Abby were now in the hall telling her she was disgusting and creepy, and I was just trying to apologize and tell her she just needed help. But one of the last things she said to me was that, again, I would pay with my soul, and she would curse me until I die, and then kind of mumbled something under her breath before running down the hall and out the door. None of us were willing to go back to sleep, so we left a message with the owners and just sat around waiting to see if she would come back. Weeks turned to months, and she never did. Her parents never even saw or heard from her. Every few weeks, I would receive a package that had to be hand-delivered since there was no postage but was addressed to me. Each time, it had some creepy stuff in it. The head of an animal, similar to what was in her room. There were weird, cryptic, if not threatening messages and images, and each time, I would just walk it out to the dumpster. Gabriella moved out, not feeling safe, and Erin moved after the end of her lease she agreed on. I was fine with staying there, but once the packages started coming, I started getting this sense I was being watched everywhere. While I was there, when I was at the store, driving to work, all the time. I felt like I was becoming paranoid with this overwhelming sense of dread, or like someone was going to kill me. So I eventually moved out too. I kept in touch with Erin and Gabriella though, and they never received anything, so I was the lucky winner. Like I mentioned, this was several years ago, and I checked the news, Facebook, Twitter, all of that, and I don't think she's ever returned. It's really amazing, not in a good way, and terrifying as to what may have happened to her, but I guess she just doesn't want to be found. But I would like this feeling of being watched to go away.
I used to work the overnight shift at a certain 24/7 store that sold a bit of everything. You know that one. It's big, associated with the color blue, and a big asterisk for their logo. You know which store I'm talking about. But if you don't, then you probably shop at the competitor with the big red circle. I think you get the picture I'm trying to paint here. Anyways, I worked for the store on the overnight shift for a few years, and I generally hated it. The worst part about working overnights in a department store is the customers. You get some real characters coming into the store at 3 in the morning. Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration. Of the people that come in overnight were decent people, just trying to get something last minute. That said, the people that were the aforementioned characters were weird. We had a lot of people come in that were very clearly on some sort of substance, or just completely trashed out of their minds. So, with this being the norm, you gotta think that if I have a horror story, then it has to be something truly terrifying, right? Well, that thought would be correct. There was one night that definitely stands out, one customer that definitely made an impact on my memory. This actually happened during my first year working there, probably around month 9. One night, me and my new hubby, Jack, were working, stocking the shelves and making our comments about customers when we knew they were out of earshot. One of the customers was some guy that was on something. Again, it was easy to tell. His eyes were wide, he was twitchy, and he looked paranoid about everything around him. Anyways, we watched this guy walk through the aisles like he was trying to find something. I actually paused and asked if he needed help with anything, and he told me that he was fine in a tone that was incredibly dismissive. I just shrugged it off and went back to shoving items onto the shelf. After a few minutes, Jack nudges me and tells me to come with him, so I do. We walk away from our stock point and into another aisle, where Jack then tells me that the guy from earlier, the paranoid guy, looked like he was following a woman that had passed by, and he wanted to make sure we were ready just in case something happened. I mentioned we should get a CSM involved, and he agrees, grabbing his walkie and asking for a CSM, customer service manager, to come to the section we were in. We were standing off to the side and pretending to put more stuff on the shelf when we hear a woman shriek. We both turn to see what was going on. Then we seriously see this guy walking away from the woman with a baby in his arms. This guy had apparently waited for the woman to not be looking at the cart and snatched this woman's infant son out of the seat and was walking away nonchalant like it was his kid. He wasn't running or making a full-on getaway. He was just walking away from the woman that was screaming at him to give back her child. Obviously, the commotion caught the attention of everyone nearby, which was pretty much just employees. Since Jack and I saw what happened, we went over to block the guy from getting too far. We started telling the guy to stop and to give back the baby. Jack kept trying to actually physically stop the guy. It was pretty clear to me that he was getting agitated. The look on his face went from calm to angered, and he started muttering something about how we were trying to take his son from him. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, he reaches his hand into his pocket, pulls out a small switchblade-looking knife, and shoves it into Jack's arm as hard as he could. He then continues to walk off while Jack is screaming bloody murder, and the entire crowd of employees is freaking out. At this point, adrenaline kind of kicked in, and I knew that I had to do something. I pretty much threw myself onto this guy's back and started trying to choke him out as best as I could. I'm not really a strong guy or anything, but I used to watch a lot of wrestling. While that may have been fake as hell, I learned a thing or two. So at this point, this guy has successfully stolen a child and was attempting to leave the store. Grabbed my coworker and was now being choked out by me, all in the matter of around 2 minutes. If I were to say this was the longest 2 or so minutes of my life, it would be an understatement. So thankfully, this story does have a happier ending than some. Once my coworkers saw me trying to take the man down, they stepped in and got the child out of his arms. It took a couple of us to actually get the guy to the ground. Yet another side effect of being on certain substances. We got the baby back to the lady, who obviously asked for her to stick around for the police. The CSM got to the back and tended to Jack, who thankfully was alright, just in immense pain. Once the cops got there, I had to give a statement on what happened. I explained the whole situation, and what I told them was backed up by security camera footage. In the end, he was hauled off. She got her baby back, Jack got some time off work, and I was commended for my bravery. Which, it wasn't bravery. It was pure adrenaline and me honestly having no idea what to do. Thankfully, though, I think I chose the right option.
Several years ago, my wife, our daughter, and I were invited to a birthday party. It was a friend of ours' first child, and being that they were pretty well off, they always went all out on these parties. They'd rent out a place, they would supply all the food and drinks, and they usually hired a few different entertainment vendors, like a DJ, a bounce house, and, you guessed it, clowns. The kid was maybe about 5 or 6 at the time, so I suppose they may have been interested in it, but upon getting there, they definitely seemed more interested in playing dress up. It was supposed to be a princess/ball style, so there were tons of kids in big dresses and suits. The party wasn't too bad though. It was at a community center, and as expected, they had different foods and snacks, all served on the fake painted silver plasticware to make it look royal, I suppose. The clown, of course, was then dressed to be more like a jester. He was doing silly stunts and magic tricks, as well as balloon animals and crowns. The kids seemed entertained for a while, and then would lose interest. He did well at keeping character even when kids weren't aware. He walked around and offered balloons to the kids, he'd help them up the blow-up slide, and even casually talk to us. He didn't give off any weird vibes either. Anything borderline weird, like when a kid hurt their leg, or when another's dress got caught on something, he'd have a parent come over to help. Definitely seemed like an up-and-up guy, and we even mentioned it to our friend. Mackenzie actually said that she had been referred to this guy by other people in her area that had used him before, and they all had great reviews, other than those complaining he didn't have enough balloon animal options. She decided to go with him. As the party was ending, kids were beginning to get tired, and some were cranky and crying, so I walked out back to smoke while my wife stayed with the others. As I was walking out, I saw the clown leaning against a crappy old car smoking as well. Again, the guy deals with kids all day for a living, so I can't say I blame him. I walked over to him and we started talking a bit. I thanked him and he commented that there were some of the better behaved kids he had worked with. I don't know where the conversation devolved from there, but we got on the topic of careers, and so I took a shot and asked him why he chose to be a clown. I remember him just staring at me for a minute and making a comment along the lines of, "Well, you seem like a truthful guy," and stared at me a little longer. He then looked away and said something about, "It's the job on the books." I didn't know what he meant by that, so I just laughed and he stared at me. Now, it felt awkward, so I had just shrugged and said, "Yeah, of course." Finally, he laughed too and made a comment about how, "I knew you'd get it. You have a family to take care of, so you'd do whatever you needed for them, right?" So I agreed. I don't know what I did or said to make him trust me, but from there, he just started unloading. He started talking about how it started with him working at the post office with his mother after he got out of jail for possession. His mom made him get a job since he was going to be living with her, and he started learning, as he put it, business and government politics. And he hated how they were so strict on things you could do and couldn't do there. He hated how much they took out in taxes, so he started to do his own little research. He started asking questions on forums, researching, and even started his own website to post his own blogs. This got him into what I'm just going to call it as it is, conspiracies. He said he learned about the different types of taxes that were taken out and wanted to know what they were used for. That's when he found the wrong forums for answers. He learned that the money goes to the government on the checks, but it actually goes to the NSA to fund their experiments and operations. Stunned at how well he held in the crazy and trying not to laugh, I just asked what he meant by operations. He stopped and looked around at first and said, "There are people around us that aren't who they appear to be." Again, I asked what he meant by that. He then started talking about how when someone seems different, like when they don't remember important details, like memories, dates, names, or when someone looks just different enough, like their eyes were green and now they appear brown. He said that's when the NSA snatches people up, brainwashes them to become their drone basically, and then release them back into the public to continue life as normal. I asked why they would do this, and his reasoning was to spy on us. He said they do this so that they have inconspicuous people around to see where people are making money and how much. That way they could adjust taxes or add new tax bills, or to see if they are a threat to their operations or experiments, and if they need to be taken out. So what does all of this have to do with being a clown? He said that way the government could see how much money he's making and do what they want with it while he ran his website and video channel on how to stay safe and gave lessons that he charged for, products he sold, and donations, which was where he made his real money. That way, they also couldn't trace his purchases. He even continued to live with his mom, so he didn't need a high-paying job and just paid his mom for rent. All this just tossed at me to a guy that seemed completely sane playing around our kids. I took one more shot and asked him how he knew about any of this and what made him think it was real. He then handed me a piece of cardstock with some name and website written on it. He said he didn't want to pay for business cards as that would then be on public records, and this was to be kept more underground. All he would tell me was that he was just a regular old Joe Schmo, and that's what was written on the card. Great. He said I should check it out as he had better info on it and great packages on how to check your home for any bugs, or how to check friends and family without giving yourself away. I started putting the card away when my wife walked out and asked me to help inside. I agreed and started wrapping up with this Joe when he asked if I had noticed anything different about my wife. I told him no, and he told me to keep an eye out as they are typically the first ones to go, women because they are easier to abduct. So I told him I'd keep an eye out, thanked him, and started walking back in, to which he shouted, "I'll check in with you later," and nodded to him. I didn't notice till I was back inside what he had said. I didn't give him any of my information. Thinking he just thought he did, I let it go. What I did not let go, though, was telling Mackenzie. I don't know if he should be around kids or even people. What if he suspected someone at a party? What would he try to do? She said she was going to report it, but that's about all I knew. However, our interactions wouldn't stop there. I started noticing this guy a few times during the next few days. He would be sitting in his car, smoking, just watching me leave work, my kids' school, and even my home. I didn't tell my wife because I didn't want to freak her out, but my wife noticed him outside our home. I was pissed and scared. I didn't know what he was thinking of doing. My wife said she was going to call the police, but I went out there to confront him. I don't remember what all I said, but I just remember becoming even angrier because he was just smiling. His reasoning was that he spilled a lot of information to me and didn't go through the proper steps to make sure I was really trustworthy, so he had to follow up. He was obviously able to find out who I was and all about me, which was terrifying, but he said I had been cleared and I wouldn't ever see him in person again, and left. The cops did show up and we gave as much information as possible. I didn't even have the card anymore as I thought it was BS, so I just threw it away. I will say, I never saw him again after that. No threats, no calls, never saw him. I don't know whatever happened to him, but the number Mackenzie used to book him didn't work anymore. I know this happened several years ago, but I always think about this whenever I notice someone doesn't remember something they very well should.
I was on a long drive trip a while back, headed to a different state for a work event that I was pretty much told I needed to be part of. I was given the options to fly or to drive a rental car out there. If I drove, I had to do it on the weekend, and I wouldn't be paid for the mileage, which, whatever. I am terrified of flying, so I chose driving. There's no particular reason for me to be terrified of flying. The 2 times I've been on a plane, I have had full-blown panic attacks that have ended in me vomiting. I think it's just me. I just get freaked out and panic. So obviously, I told my boss that I would get a rental and drive to the conference. The trip took way longer than I honestly anticipated, and I was driving pretty late into the night. And at that point where this event happened, I was running low on gas. I wasn't low enough that I would have ended up on the side of the highway. At least, I don't think so. But I was low enough that I made plans to fill up at the next station I saw on an exit sign. I went for a while longer, saw that there was a station at the next exit that indicated it was open 24 hours. And I thought that I should consider stopping to use the restroom, get something to drink, and then fill up my tank. I pulled off, and after a bit of searching, I found the station. It was decently lit, so that wasn't a huge deal for me. But as I parked, I noticed that in the same parking lot as the station was what looked like an old motel. It was boarded up. It kind of looked like a stereotypical old motel. 2 floors, 3 rooms on each floor, and then 1 extra room at the bottom that had the word office on the door. A couple of rooms were missing their doors. Some of them were just boarded up. Some of the windows looked smashed. Honestly, it was a bit unsettling. But I wasn't here for lodging. I was there for gas. I headed into the station and it looked decent, at the very least. Like, it was a bit dim, and a couple of fluorescent bulbs were burnt out. But the floor plan was clean, and everything was well stocked. It wasn't a small station either. There was actually a good amount of space, and everything looked open, so it was kept up. There were 2 guys standing at the front counter talking to the clerk, and honestly, none of them looked too threatening. They just looked pretty normal. As I walked in, the clerk turned his attention to me, and he very politely asked me if he could help me find anything. I asked if he had a restroom, and he motioned towards the back. I nodded and headed back and did my business. As I was washing my hands, though, I heard what sounded like all 3 men giggling like schoolchildren. what I don't know, at the same time, people laughing isn't necessarily a bad thing or creepy. It was just something I noted. When I walked out of the restroom, I could literally feel the three men just staring at me as I went over to the cooler to get something to drink. Something to drink for the rest of the trip and grabbed a snack. I thought they would look away or break their stares as I walked towards the counter. Nope, the all three just kept watching me as I approached. I tried my best to ignore it as the guy scanned my items, but after a few moments of my skin starting to crawl as the other two were glaring, I looked over towards them with a look like, "Alright, I know you're staring, you can stop now." As soon as my attention was turned towards them, one of the guys took this opportunity to say, "We are making a bet on something and wanted to know, what would you rate me out of 10? This caught me a bit off guard. I wasn't really sure what to say. I just kind of scoffed and turned back towards the clerk. Unfortunately, he was in on their game, and he was just staring at me with his eyes wide, holding my Red Bull. At this point, I was annoyed, so I just said that I would like to pay for my stuff and go. He told me that he would give me my things when I answered the question. I said I wasn't interested in whatever this was, and that would just like to pay and go. Once again, he laughed and said, "Not until you answer him." At this point, I decided that it wasn't worth my time to put up with this, and there were three of them versus one of me. I turned, and I walked away from them, but as soon as I reached the door, I felt a hand reach out and grab my hip. Unfortunately, for the person that grabbed me, which is a man, that had asked me to rate him, as I was walking towards the door, I had actually unhooked my pepper spray from my keys. I had a small cartridge that had a key ring on it, and he took the full blast of it to the face. The other two started yelling at me. He started screaming, and I turned and took off towards my car. Thankfully, the car had a push start, so I was able to get the engine going and get onto the road before the three of them could even get out into the parking lot. The whole time, I was pulling away and getting back on the highway. I was looking back at my rear view, seeing if they were following me, which thankfully they weren't. After about 5 minutes of being back on the highway, pulled over and resituated myself, trying to calm down and get through the anxiety attack that was definitely hitting me. In the end, I was thankful that I had the mental withdrawal to grab my pepper spray while I was walking. I just had that feeling that one of them was going to try something. I ended up going for another half hour until I found a gas station in a much less creepy and much more populated area. I filled up without an issue. This was definitely the event that made it click. These things can happen to me, and I'm way more aware of my surroundings now. Before they started in on being a creep, I really didn't get any red flags. Even those that don't seem like creeps can be the worst. I'm not saying be paranoid and scared of everyone, just that being prepared is always a good idea.
This actually happened to me last week, and I'm still kind of freaking out about it in my head and trying to process what I saw. I live in an apartment complex that was recently built, like within the last year. They started tearing down a patch of trees that blocked the highway on the other side to build this place, so it disrupted some wildlife, I'm sure. The town I live in doesn't have much in the way of multi-dwelling homes like apartments. It's been more for retirees and senior living, so besides moving away, this was one of the cheapest places to live, other than a house, so that's why I chose it, besides the fact that it was close to my mom and my job. So to get to the complex, you have to take a road that was basically made to get to this place. It was pretty long because it sits back in that carved out field, and since it's still surrounded by some trees, you can still see a bit of wildlife. When I'm driving, I typically go slower down that road because I see deer, possums, squirrels, and even a few feral cats cross it. It's beautiful at my apartment too, because sitting out on the balcony, I get a view of the trees, and sometimes I can see deer in there or a bunch of birds flying around. One of my neighbors actually has bird and squirrel feeders that she not only puts by her patio, but also closer to the trees, so they were away from people. It was a nice view. Anyways, this happened when I was driving home from my mom's place late one night. I went there to have dinner after work, since I was off later and she invited me over, so I didn't have to spend money on food. I can never say no to her cooking anyways. It was about 9 or so when I left, and I was already feeling tired. As I was driving back, I was trying my hardest to focus as the lights dimmed when I went between the street lights. At one point, I saw something on all four legs crossing the road, so I started slowing down. As I came to a stop, I really got a better look at the animal and I was horrified. My car was just a bit in front of the light where the animal was on the other side of it. Based on what I could see in the light and its shape, I could tell it was a deer, but there was something horribly wrong with it. What I thought at first was mud or something in its fur had to be blood and flesh. It looked like all the fur on that side of its body was gone, and I was just looking at the skin. The only way I can think to describe it was like that side of the body had been scraped off. Its leg was the same way, and in fact, I'm pretty sure I could see part of the leg bone and jawbone. I was panicking in my head, thinking something obviously happened to this thing, and it was going to collapse right in front of me. Instead, it just stood there staring at me, as if there was nothing wrong with it. In fact, it didn't even seem intimidated or scared of me. Still confused about what I was seeing though, and since it wasn't moving, I decided to get out of my car and try to get closer. The minute I opened my door and started walking around it, the smell hit me. It was the smell of decay and rot. I felt like I was going to be sick, so I pulled my shirt up over my nose and tried to mask the smell. I got a little closer and I could confirm that I was definitely seeing raw flesh. I really don't understand how this deer was alive and even standing in front of me. I said something under my breath like, "What the fuck?" or something to that effect, and that's when the deer started backing up. I didn't know what it would do or could do, being injured to this extent, so I backed up to give it space, and that's when I heard a loud plop coming from the trees on the right, where the deer was walking from. Within the time it took me to look in that direction, the deer bolted across the road and took off. I watched it for a few seconds as it ran away without as much as a limp, when I heard another sound coming from the opposite side. It sounded like something big was falling to the ground, like out of the tree. At this point, that putrid smell of death was still lingering, and I was getting this overwhelming sense of dread. So I ran back to my car, locking the doors, and sat there looking into the trees. That's when I saw something moving around in the trees that very clearly wasn't a deer. It was trying to walk on all four, but the movement wasn't right. It was choppy and very uncoordinated. It almost reminded me of a fawn trying to walk for the first time, as well as a human trying to walk on their hands. And the back was very rigid and curved. I had no clue what I was looking at, but it terrified me, so I took off. I have never driven that fast down that road, but I know I didn't want to be there anymore, and maybe even wasn't supposed to be there. When I got home, I looked around before getting out of my car, and when it looked safe, I made a mad dash to the building, pulling the door shut, then running up the stairs to my place and quickly locking the door. I went and looked out my balcony door to see if I could see anything on that side of the woods, which was opposite from the one I was at, so I didn't expect to see anything, but I was still paranoid and scared. When I didn't see anything, I took some time to try and calm myself down and called my dad to talk about it with him. As expected, he told me the deer was probably in some kind of accident and was in shock and probably died shortly after my encounter with him. I tried to stay reasonable and keep that in mind, but then I was confused about the big thing trying to imitate a deer. However, I didn't tell my dad about that one. I figured he'd probably just think I was seeing things. I haven't told anyone else about this until now because it's still nightmare fuel for me. I want to be reasonable and say maybe it was just another deer with some kind of weird deformity, but was it? Was that really what I saw? Or is there something more sinister in those woods? All I know is I haven't seen it since, thankfully, and I don't stop like that anymore at night, no matter what road I'm on. So that, my friends, was another scary story collection. Haven't done a mix of stories in a minute, so we were definitely due for one. And this one was special because I had a dear friend of mine join me on this, and that was Curious Raven. She was kind enough to read us some stories and also have me on her channel, so please do show her some love and check her out. I will link her channel in the description below. And if you did enjoy this video, please do give it a like below, and if you'd like to hear more content like this, consider subscribing. Consider? What did I just say? Consider subscribing if you haven't already. And lastly, don't forget to leave a comment on your thoughts, or let me know, what was the last movie you watched? Was it any good? Would you recommend it? And with that being said, friends, I hope you have a fantastic week, and until next time, take care.